2003. Jet Li stood at the peak of his career. Warner Brothers wanted him for the Matrix sequels, the biggest franchise in cinema. The role, Seraph, the guardian who fights Neo in what would become one of the trilogy's most iconic sequences. The offer came with a number, a substantial number. But it also came with something else, 6 months in a motion capture suit. The fine print specified that Warner Brothers would own the recorded movements as intellectual property. Forever, Lee walked away from millions. To understand why, we need to understand what Warner Brothers was really asking for. The proposal broke down like this: 9 months total commitment. Only 3 months would involve actual filming with the crew. The remaining 6 months, recording every martial arts movement Jet Li knew. Warner Brothers framed this as creating a digital library of his techniques, a comprehensive archive of his lifetime of training, captured in data form. What this actually meant: permanent transfer of intellectual property rights. The technology context matters here. Matrix Reloaded's Burly Brawl demonstrated exactly this capability. The sequence where Neo fights hundreds of Agent Smith clones wasn't just visual effects wizardry. Those clones were motion-captured performances, multiplied infinitely. The same actor, the same movements, replicated without limit. Seraph's role required extensive martial arts choreography against Neo. Warner Brothers needed someone whose movements could carry that weight. Lee's wushu mastery made him the ideal candidate. But Lee understood the calculation differently. "I've been training my entire life," he later explained. "Martial artists grow older. They could own this forever." The cultural dimension runs deeper than the legal terms. In wushu tradition, movements carry signature. They distinguish one practitioner from another, like a painter's brushstroke or a musician's phrasing. Hollywood treated martial arts as generic stunts, interchangeable physical labor. Hong Kong cinema viewed them as the performer's essence. The movements weren't just what the actor did, they were who the actor was. Lee recognized the asymmetry immediately. One-time payment for perpetual usage rights. Warner Brothers could theoretically use his captured movements on any CGI character in any future film. No residuals, no additional compensation, no creative control over how his lifetime of training would be deployed. The studio would own his physical vocabulary. Every kick, every strike, every defensive sequence he'd spent decades perfecting. They could apply those movements to different characters, different stories, different contexts entirely. The data would outlive his career, his body, his ability to perform. Lee's concerns weren't hypothetical paranoia. The studio system had done this before. The Precedent case, Crispin Glover and Back to the Future Part 2, released in 1989. Glover played George McFly in the original film. When he declined to return for the sequel over salary disputes, Universal Pictures found a workaround. They used prosthetics and a face mold, created during the first film, to recreate Glover's likeness. Another actor wore the prosthetics. The character appeared on screen. Glover received no consent, no payment, no notification. Glover sued. The case established a critical precedent. Studios would bypass actors if legally possible. The lawsuit resulted in Screen Actors Guild regulations on unauthorized likeness use. Those protections covered physical prosthetics and makeup effects. But those protections only covered physical prosthetics, not digital capture. By 2003, motion capture existed in a legal gray zone. The technology had advanced beyond what the existing regulations anticipated. The SAG rules didn't account for digital replication. Warner Brothers' Matrix technology represented the next evolution of the same impulse. The same institutional logic that led Universal to recreate Glover's face now operated at the data level. The studio's perspective followed clear financial logic, efficiency, and asset creation. Why pay an aging martial artist repeatedly when you could own his movements permanently? Why negotiate future salary increases when you could eliminate the need for the performer entirely? The calculation made perfect sense from a balance sheet perspective. Create a reusable digital asset library that appreciates rather than depreciates. Lock in the cost, eliminate future variables. Lee recognized this as vertical integration applied to human performance. The studio wasn't just hiring him for a role, they were attempting to acquire his lifetime of training as corporate property. The distinction matters. Hiring involves temporary exchange, labor for payment. Acquisition involves permanent transfer. The asset becomes company property. Notably, Lee later did motion capture work for the 2004 video game Jet Li: Rise to Honor. This demonstrates his objection wasn't to the technology itself. His objection was specifically to the ownership terms, to the permanence, to the asymmetry of compensation versus usage rights. The video game involved a licensing arrangement with defined parameters. The Matrix proposal involved indefinite ownership with unlimited application. Lee's refusal seemed like an isolated incident at the time, one actor's personal decision about one contract for one role. 20 years later, it became the front line of an industry-wide battle. Fast forward to 2023, Screen Actors Guild, American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, authorized a strike with 98% membership approval. The core issue: studios proposed scanning background actors for one day's pay. The scans would grant permanent rights to actors' digital likenesses. The exact scenario Jet Li predicted in 2003. The union described studio proposals as allowing replacement of actors through generative AI. AMPTP, the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, wanted one-time fees for indefinite usage rights, precisely what Lee rejected 2 decades earlier. The strike lasted from July 14th to November 9th, 2023. 4 months of halted production across the industry. The ratified agreement introduced mandatory rules on digital replicas. New protections require informed consent and compensation for digital likeness use. The payment structure changed fundamentally. Creation time plus residuals based on equivalent workdays. If a studio uses your digital replica for a scene that would have taken 3 days to shoot, they pay for 3 days. The contrast illuminates the shift. Lee fought this battle alone in 2003 as an individual negotiation. One actor against one studio over one contract. By 2023, it required 160,000 performers striking collectively for 4 months. The institutional shift reveals the stakes. What was once a commercial struggle for one star became an existential threat to the entire profession. Warner Bros. Discovery's current position carries its own irony. The company now faces acquisition battles over its own intellectual property portfolio. Studios that sought to own performers' digital assets now struggle with their own IP ownership. Motion capture has become standard practice across the industry, but the terms shifted. The power dynamic changed. Lee's foresight wasn't mystical. He understood that in the digital age, your body of work could literally become studio property. The metaphor became literal. The broader implication extends beyond contract clauses. This represented the fundamental tension between performer rights and corporate intellectual property claims. The technology enabled new forms of extraction. The legal framework hadn't caught up. The performers had to force the system to adapt. The decision that seemed like career suicide in 2003 looks like survival instinct today. Jet Li didn't just walk away from the Matrix. He refused to become a precedent. The contract clause he rejected is now standard battleground territory. What changed? Individual resistance became collective protection. The system adapted only when forced to by unified labor action. Subscribe to see how these historical power struggles continue shaping the industry.